Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Please welcome Robert to the stage.
My topic's a bit more simple. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no problem. It will be a bit simpler, and it's basically about income today, which I think is probably the topic that is front of mind for most people, whether they be retail, institutional, or in your case, for not-for-profits. It's a very important topic, and you'll notice a lot of the numbers that I show in today's presentation are out of date really quickly. I only did this presentation a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, and the numbers are already out of date. You may or may not have noticed the world's become a more volatile place in the last couple of weeks. So, but the point is, it's probably become more topical today than it even was when we wrote this, because interest rates are falling further as a result of what is happening globally. I'm sure everyone read that really quickly while I was talking. Today I want to talk about a historical perspective, to let you know where we are today and where we've come from, and then to give you a bit of a brief as well as our expectations of interest rates going forward and what that really means to you in the real world. You hear a lot of jargon with regards to interest rates, and bond rates and all these different numbers that come from the RBA and different governments around the world. What does it mean for you though in the real world? And then I want to discuss major risk factors. Today's presentation is not about selling you anything, it's about letting you know what options you have to get the returns that you may need for your liquidity purposes or for your return purposes, but also acknowledging that every incremental point of return that you get above the cash rate or the risk-free rate, there is additional risk as well. So just an understanding of that, hopefully you'll get by the end of today's speech. And then what are the solutions? I'll give you some ideas about what you can consider for your investments to achieve those returns that you would require to run your organisations. So firstly, this is the outdated chart now. Still, you can tell this goes back to 1991. In the black, you've got the 10-year government bond. That's effectively the rate the government borrows at. And the red is the RBA cash rate, which is the Reserve Bank of Australia, and what the official cash rate is. Everyone would have known last week they cut by a further 25 basis points. They're now down to 0.5%. Are we extraordinary in this world? Unfortunately not. This shows you Australia, Germany, the US and the UK. You'll notice that Germany is below that black line. That means they will pay you a negative interest rate for the benefit of buying their bonds. You buy German government bonds, you'll get a negative interest rate of 0.7. So today the Australian 10-year bond rate is at 0.77, give or take a couple of basis points. The US is at 0.8%. Germany's at negative 0.74. And that is as of last night's close. Just to give you indications, this is not an Australian issue, this is a global issue, and there is worse off than Australia. I think they might go to zero, but that most likely they'll then do quantitative easing, which is a more, a less conventional way of trying to pump prime the system. That's a bit more technical, but effectively it's basically where the Reserve Bank tries to promote the banks to put money into the system. There's a lot of issues that come with that, and it doesn't help people like yourselves who are investors. So think of this as a tax on savers. If you have money, the reality is what the central banks of the world are telling you, what the bond markets of the world are telling you, that you need to shift up the risk curve to get the appropriate return that you need. Anyone here know what the bond rate, the inflation rate in Australia is at the moment?
Oh, no, not for the
Yeah. Inflation is 1.8, 1.9%. So think about 1.9% of inflation. When you're getting an interest rate below that, that means you have a negative real interest rate. You're actually losing real money or real buying power in this particular environment. This is a global phenomenon. So hopefully at the end of my talk today, you at least know what your options are and how much risk you need to take, and then you can say, well, what we need for my organisation is X, and this we may consider this type of product to get the needs that you need for your situation.
So typically what happened as long as the government is doing that.
Sorry,
What the government recommended as long as the government is doing that.
Oh yeah, but that helps the government. So the government goes in the deficit, they pay less in interest too, so it's not a bad thing for the government either. So this is the real world. This is TD rates at present. So hopefully you can read that. So the top is for 30 days, you get 0.7%, going all the way down to, let's go 1,095 days, which is 3 years, which is 1.22%. These will probably drop lower, most likely drop lower from these levels as well. What this tells you is, and what I find interesting, is that if you go for a 180 day, or let's call it half a year, you'll get 1.38% at the moment. If you go for 3 years, you'll get 1.22. In a normal world, 3 years should get you a higher rate than 180 days. What that's telling you is the bond market expects rates to fall further than where they are today. So to your point, will they go to zero, will they go? The market's telling you they're going lower than where they are today. Otherwise, for more duration, a longer period, you should be getting a higher rate. What I also find interesting is that if you give them $2 million, normally you put more with any business that you deal with, they'll give you a better rate. They actually give you a worse rate. So if you look to the right-hand side, that's $2 million plus, it's worse than under $2 million. This is telling you that this is not the best funding source for banks. They don't really want your money in these areas. So if you think about what's going to happen in the future, this guy down the bottom, Jerome Powell, the head of the Reserve Bank of the United States, he's effectively saying he needs inflation to go above 2%. So they aim for 2%. That's a normal range for most central banks. They want 2% inflation. They find that the healthy sort of level of inflation. He's saying that not only will we let inflation run beyond 2%, we want to see it for a sustainable period. So let's call that here, they want to see it for 6 to 9 to 12 months of above normal inflation, which, mind you, since the GFC has not gone above this level. They want to see that before they start raising interest rates. So the reality is, we're not going to get an increase in interest rates. There's no pressure on the upside. In fact, now, with the coronavirus occurring, they had a 50 basis point cut last week, an emergency cut, and there's anticipation that next week when they meet, they'll cut another 50 basis points, or 0.5%. And the US will go to sub 0.5% interest rates. And this is the strongest global economy at the moment. So it tells you something. And when the biggest bank in the world says that to you, that's a big deal. I've never seen this before. And this is telling you they can't get inflation up and don't expect interest rates to rise in the short term or probably medium term. I've got this seems kind of irrelevant right now with what's going on globally with coronavirus and the effect that's having on supply and demand. But how could we be wrong? Is if inflation picks up beyond those levels, let's call it to 2 to 3%. The last 10 years they haven't been able to do that. In the short term, it's definitely not going to happen. In fact, when you have oil prices dropping 30%, that's deflationary. And that's one of the biggest input costs we've got in the world. Wage growth accelerates. Well, that's not going to happen either because there's not enough demand. There's not enough growth occurring at the moment. And thirdly, I put it in there, if we have some phenomenal technology that comes up, it improves productivity, that improves growth. That's more of a long-term shift generally. That's more of a structural shift, so that's unlikely to do anything in the short term. This here is an important chart to understand the gamut of investment options that you have. Starting off at the bottom, left-hand side, is the low risk, low return. You can see cash and government bonds. Why government bonds safe? Well, most governments are the safest issuers of any debt. You'll get your money back, unless you're in Bolivia or some other tiny banana republic. You'll get your money back from the Australian government, from the US government. To the right-hand side, the riskiest is property and equities, so shares and property. This is why you should expect higher returns from things on the top side, and you should expect lower returns from the bottom. There's a big fat part in the middle, which is debt. And these things like bonds and so forth. So just to put it in context, the debt market globally is 3 times the size of the equity market. So it's a really, really big market. So that's basically all kinds of debt from corporations and governments and so forth that need money to function. That's 3 times the size of the share market globally. So I'll explain some options along that risk curve to you, just to give you an indication of what you can look for and what risk you need to take to get some returns. I think what's important is to understand risk, because quite often where our natural inclination is to go, what returns do I get? That's a fair question, but it should always be asked with, what return do I get for the risk I take? So what is risk? What type of things should you look for when somebody says to you, I can get you 6%, you're going, well, hang on, the government risk-free rate is at 0.5, you're promising 6%. What risk does that entail? So I've got a list here of a few things for you to look at or consider when somebody offers you a rate above the risk-free rate. Number one is liquidity. And by that we mean, how easy is it for you to exit that particular asset class, that particular investment? Can I get my money? How easy is it to get my money? The more liquid something is, the more attractive it is, and the less return you should get. Alternatively, if something is difficult to get out, they make you lock your money up for a period of time, which they can be fine investments, but you need to lock your money up for a period of time. You should be compensated for locking your money up. Liquidity or illiquidity has a premium, whereas something that's very liquid, and that's why government bonds are so attractive, they call it a cash proxy. There's always a market. You can always sell a government bond. If you go to a small issuer, a small company that issues their debt, well, that's a lot harder to get your money out. So always consider, how easy is it for me to get my money out? What are the conditions upon me releasing my cash? And that's for you guys, I'm sure. You all run different not-for-profits. Some of you may have money you need to pay a day, a week, a month, 6 months, 2 years. That is a really important consideration. Interest rate movements. Generally, what will happen if interest rates drop, any interest-bearing asset should increase in price. So that's when they say the bond market is in a bull market. That means the yields or the actual interest rate you're getting is dropping. So it's an inverse reaction. What's important to consider with that is you have 2 types of bonds or 2 types of issuance normally that pays you interest. You can have floating rate or you have fixed rate. Fixed rate means I take it off you today and you promise me 2.5%. Come what may. Floating rate normally has a benchmark, and you move with that benchmark. So let's say interest rates drop, your interest rate will drop with it, and if the interest rates increase, then you will be compensated with an increase in interest rates as well. So they're 2 very distinct characteristics of bonds or any interest-bearing asset class. So they're 2 considerations to make. Now, not that you're going to be a bond trader or anyone, but if you think to yourself, we think interest rates are going to remain low or go lower, well, you're not going to go. You'll most likely have a fixed rate of interest, because that's where you'll get the major benefit from. You don't want to have your interest rate dropping, so they're considerations to make. Things like government bonds are normally fixed. They'll say this is the rate, and the actual bond itself will move, but they will fix it, whereas corporates will generally have a floating rate, so you can then get compensated as it moves. And the other thing to consider is when you have any instrument that pays you any interest, the longer you hold it, you should get compensated for it. It also makes it more sensitive to interest rate movements. So if you've got an instrument you'll get your money back in 90 days, it's not going to be that sensitive to interest rate moves. If you have an instrument that you take for 5 years, and interest rates move in that period, well, they're going to have, the price of that particular product is going to move a lot more, because they're a lot more sensitive to that price, that change, because you have a longer period they need to pay you that interest for. Corporate structure. This is something that's really important, because often you're getting issued, you're lending to somebody, and you need to understand that if the worst happens, effectively they go bankrupt, where am I in the order of getting paid? Are they obligated to pay me? Is it accrued? And in the example for shares, for example, they pay great dividends. A company is under no obligation to pay you a dividend. Whereas if you're a bondholder, it's a contract. They'll always stipulate whether or not they have to pay you, number one, whether it accrues, or it's just they have to pay it. So they have a contract, it's different to a share. But understand that what order you're in to get paid if the worst happens. And this is every time you take an investment, you always need to consider the risk of the worst case scenario occurring. The worst case scenario is going broke. And then if they do go broke, think of yourself as a company, you borrow money. The last person to get paid is you. As the equity holder, you own the company. You must pay your creditors first, and whatever's left over goes to the shareholders. That's why shares should give you a higher return. If you want security, you go senior debt, but with that comes lower rates. So always know that if you get a lower rate, it's because you're probably higher up the corporate structure. But if anyone ever says to you, we've got some bonds that pay X, always ask them, if they go broke, where am I in the order of preference of getting paid first? And then lastly is counterparty risk. Who are you actually lending your money to? Because always think about it, if you've got interest-bearing assets, you're lending money to people. Bonds is lending money to people. How good are they? How good is their balance sheet? What is their history of paying back their debt? And this is one of the particularly important with situations that are occurring now. We have demand dropping off because of the virus going globally. A lot of businesses, now you think of it, you lent money to a tourism business last year. They rely on tourism coming through. No one's coming into the country at the moment, as an example. They're going to struggle to pay back their debts. So this is why it's important to always assess, well, who am I lending money to? And this is a big risk. It can be quite difficult, but we have things, and you would have heard, like S&P and Moody's, they have ratings agencies that basically look at the risks involved for these businesses, assess their balance sheets, and then they'll give it a high rating, so an A rating. They can go all the way down to C below that. So there is ratings agencies that do that for you as well. So that's something to always consider. So with that, what are your options? I've got here from enhanced cash, bonds, equities, private credit and infrastructure. Essentially, it's starting from enhanced cash is the lowest risk, going all the way up to infrastructure. Now, I could probably say the last three are very similar in risk. They're towards the upper end of that risk curve. But I thought I'd give you just a brief on these things. I won't go into too much detail, other than that you understand what they can provide with returns, what risks they give you, and what duration and liquidity you have with these different options. But they can vary. Sorry, go on. Oh, it's just, to be honest with you, it's our marketing person thought this looks good. Yeah. No, but it just is to let you know but that's why I pointed out start with enhanced cash and it goes towards the riskier side, with the last three being kind of equivalent. I should have really put that on that slide so you understand where these things are, but I'll explain that as well, where they sit on the risk spectrum. So enhanced cash. So when it's not really cash, what it is basically taking instruments, generally bank instruments, so high credit rated banks. Think about the top 4 banks in Australia, where they have 90 to 180 day requirements for cash. And they will do short-term bonds, essentially, where they need short-term coverage. They will pay you between, at the moment, it's probably dropped from there from 2.25 to 2.5. Think about it as 2.25%. That's kind of the return you're getting at the moment from enhanced cash. And remember, we're going 0.5 being the cash rate. You still got risk. You still got risks which we think are low, and they are low. That's why you're getting 2.25 versus other options of the banks going broke and not being able to pay you. But that's the kind of rate you'll get from that type of instrument. Very liquid. Generally, it's very easy to go into one of these. To access them, you either have to be an institution and you've got to buy $500,000 lots, or you buy a fund that gives you access to these particular instruments. Very liquid, easy to get out of. Generally, within 3 to 5 days, you can get your money from this type of instrument. Then there's bonds. This is very broad. So bonds can range from government bonds, as I was saying before, all the way up to any corporate. Any corporate can issue a bond and borrow money. So you can essentially go from negative interest rates, like I explained before. The German government has a negative interest rate. Very secure. The German government's good for that money, but you'll get negative 0.7%. You can go to a corporate which has very dodgy balance sheets, a very cyclical industry. You don't quite know what the risks are. There could be high risk in their business model, and then you're low in the corporate structure. You can get somewhere between 12, 13, 14%. It's a great return, very high risk. So this is a very, very broad market. It caters for a lot of different people, but again, it comes down to understanding the risk that you're taking. And I think always think to yourself, this is the cash rate. If I'm getting a little bit more than that, if I'm getting a lot more than that, then there's obviously risks. Markets don't let anyone get 12%. It's a safe bet, right? That's just not the way it works. Everything is arbitraged. So I think that's the main point to take out of any bond or any bond that's presented to you or any bond fund that's presented to you. When you see the return, always equate it to the risk. Risk for these instruments are the counterparty again, as in who you're lending to, interest rate moves, like I was explaining before, fixed rate, floating rate notes, the corporate structure again, if things go bad, how do I get paid, and liquidity. With these, a government bond, no problem. You can sell a government bond anytime. Even if the world turns really bad, you'll be able to sell your government bond and get your money. That company that paid you 12, 13, 14% in times of volatility, good luck trying to sell that bond. And if somebody wants to buy it off you, they're probably going to give you 30 cents on the dollar if you're lucky. This is why you get paid that higher rate of return. How do you access these bonds? Well, again, direct. Just so you know, as a general rule, if you're in a direct bond, it's a $500,000 minimum investment. That's just for one bond. One issuer, one bond. Generally, to access this, you'll go through a managed fund of sorts or a platform which allows you to invest in a multitude of bonds in smaller increments. That's the way you would access this, and I think for your purposes, that probably makes a lot more sense. So think platform, where you go through somebody, an investment manager who can do that for you, or you go through a managed fund. Buying a single bond, unless you got a lot to invest, is probably not what you'd be looking at. Then shares. Shares pay good returns. It's Commonwealth Bank today will give you $4 a year, fully franked. Now, obviously, being a not-for-profit, you know the franking, how beneficial that can be for you, and you get your sort of 30% franking credits back as a not-for-profit. This is a very attractive place to park, but as we've seen, and this is probably a good time to talk about it, is the market has had a 20% drop in the last 2 weeks. Now, to put it in context, that is extraordinary. That's extraordinary. That's the fastest drop in history we've just had in the last 2 weeks, so you all witness it. Yeah, it's not going too well today. But just to give you an indication that this is volatile. And like I said before, no company has the obligation to pay a dividend. They like to, they want to, and generally the really good companies may drop their dividends, like strong, mature companies, but they won't go to zero. So they generally will pay, but they're under no obligation, so that's something you need to understand. On the flip side, what you'll get from, let's call it top 20 companies in Australia, is on a fully franked basis somewhere between 5 to 8% return on the income side. So it's a very attractive return, but again, it comes with volatility. The strength of shares is particularly the larger shares, which pay you those high dividends, are very liquid. You may not get it out the price you want, but you can get out. So if you've got a BHP, you've got Commonwealth Bank, you can sell those. Even in the midst of the GFC, which I worked through, or if at the moment when markets are really volatile, there's never a problem selling out. You just may not get the price you want. And liquidity is extremely important. I've worked in volatile times. The last thing you want is to go into a managed fund, for example, when you need your money and they go, we've just frozen all redemptions. That's a terrible place to be. So that is a benefit of holding shares directly. Not through a managed fund, but directly holding those shares. And I don't have to, like I said, franking credits, but I don't think I've explained to you the benefit of franking credits. So private credit, this is a big growing part of the market. Essentially, as APRA has tightened up on banks, they've reduced their lending. What that's created is what we call a private credit market, where institutions have stepped in, people themselves have stepped in to lend money to corporations, individuals, developers, and so forth, to lend them money they can't get from the bank. Now, nobody wants to go to these private credit, or in some instances they may, but generally, I can't get a loan from the bank, I go to the private credit market. They generally pay a little bit more because of that. The issue with this, and this can be from anything from corporates, so they just need it for their functioning of their job, of their company, to property developers. It can cover a whole gamut of things. So this is not limited, it's very, very broad. And generally, the returns you should expect from this type of investment is somewhere between, at the moment, 5 to 12%. It can be higher, but there's a thing called mezzanine debt where you're getting a lot riskier. You can get higher returns, but I didn't want to put it in here because I think that's probably too high for most people in the room. But somewhere between 5 to 12%, depending on the loans you're looking at in private credit, today is achievable. The issue you have there is liquidity. You go into private credit, think about it, you're a company that's just borrowed money. I want that money for 12 months, but you're locked in for 12 months. You can't get out. So if you're comfortable with that and it fits in with your requirements or your liabilities, this is a good consideration. If you need the money earlier, well, this is not a great option for you. But the way I figure it is that you've probably got different liabilities coming up at different times, so it may make up a portion of your investment, something like private credit, if it's an appropriate risk for you. You've got regulatory risk, you've got general market risk as well, as the interest rate moves, which are normal for all interest rates bearing investments. How do you access them? Well, generally, you can do them directly if you're a wholesale investor. There is opportunities to go direct where you say, well, this person wants to borrow for this reason, and we're happy to lend that to them. It's a bit more complex. The thing is to understand that with private credit, every single deal individually has its own contract with its own terms on there. So what's important is if you go into it, you do a fund which does a whole lot of them for you, and they manage it for you. Or if you're going to any individually, it's very important to read what they call the investor memorandum, which gives you the description of that and the obligation of the investor and the borrower as well. It's very important to understand the risk inherent in these particular credit deals, but just the main thing to understand, each one is an individual contract, and that's very important. That can be a good thing as well, because you can nuance different contracts depending on the industry, depending on the company. And then how to access them, like I was saying, you just go through directly or go through a fund that is a private credit fund. But again, as you can tell from those rate of return, we are going up the risk curve with these investments. And then finally, infrastructure. So infrastructure is things like railways, pipelines, gas pipelines, airports, roads. The way these will work is you need to have a longer time horizon. Essentially what will happen, they'll come to you and say, well, we need money for the next 5 to 7 years. We need to build this infrastructure. Then you essentially become an owner. And as you're an owner, as people use your infrastructure, they will pay you a rate of return. And generally that rate of return can go from anywhere between 4 up to 8%, 10%, 12%. The thing you have to note with this though, because they have to build it, and then you start getting your income, think 5 to 10 years as a minimum for this investment. This is a long-term income producer, number one. Number two, you're not going to get paid while they're building the infrastructure. So they call it a J curve. Essentially, you'll get nothing, and then you'll get your returns starting to come back to you. So this is why this is a 5 or 10 year project at minimum. This industry is great because you have GDP growth. So let's use roads as an example, Transurban for example, that should grow with GDP over time. So you've got GDP growth. They generally have regulated contracts. So so in case anyone doesn't know and you'll travel on there, Transurban has a inflation or minimum 4% increase per year. Not bad when inflation rate's at 1.9%. So this is where they'll tend to get those kind of contracts because they become essential infrastructure projects. So it's not a bad place to invest, but you're locked in for a long time, and that in itself is a risk.
How is that credit risk? Well, of course, it is a long term, so the liquidity is now, but the credit risk, according to what you're saying, you get a QB credit for example, all of these infrastructure for that. But then how do you rate that credit risk? Because these are private companies.
It depends on, so you have to understand each individual will have a different rating. So there's a regulatory risk. So for example, let's use Transurban as an example. They have a government contract that says that they will go up 4% every year. So then banks see that, banks know that. Banks will say, well, we'll lend you at really good rates for the actual infrastructure itself. So it becomes doesn't cost them a lot to get the debt on top of the equity you've put in. So that one becomes less risky. So if you have a regulatory overlay that you feel confident with, that reduces the risk. But each individual one will have its own risk levels. So it depends on how confident you are that the income that is going to get derived from that particular project can cover the interest payments plus pay you the return. So each individual one will vary, but generally they're not. They're most of the time they're in the interest of the public, so they're not very risky. So you think of it as an airport.
Well, unless you got payment like this was.
Yeah, that's right. But even then, see Wrestling, the government takes most of the hit when things don't go right. This is the thing with these infrastructure players. They say, if you want me to invest $1 billion, well, I want all these rules written into the contract. And this is why we all cop it as taxpayers when these things go wrong, is because they inbuilt that into the contract. Again, it's like so important to understand. And it does add complexity to investing, but I just want to put it up there so you understand that this is one of the options that you can invest in. You can buy Transurban today, which is running and fully operational. You can buy that on the market. If you want something that's got bigger upside for you, then you start thinking to yourself, well, do we have 10 years? If you do, then this is maybe a portion again of what your investments are. So I just wanted to give you a brief as to what are your options. Hopefully it's giving you what are my options and what are the risks entailed in these options to derive that income. It's a very difficult environment at the moment. We struggle with it, and we do this every day, and getting income is becoming harder. The reality is, going back to that quote I had from Jay Powell earlier on, the reality is they're telling you must take a higher risk. You must go up the risk spectrum. What's important for you to understand is what are your options and how much risk can we take and how much return do we need. My view is you always look at the maximum risk. Risk should always outweigh your returns, and it's almost working backwards. So whatever your return requirement may be, work backwards and go, well, this is where I'll have to invest. And then you say, well, is that too risky for us? And then I'm not sure how you then balance your budget or your liquidity needs, but this is the world that we live in today, whether we like it or not. And it's not going to change for at least the medium term. So that's a bit of a brief on where we are today. Hopefully it's given you an insight into your options, where you can get income from. But I'm happy to take any questions on any of that. If you've got anything or just general thoughts and what you guys are thinking, because I know everyone here would have different requirements for the organisations that they deal for.
So how's that linked for not-for-profit? Like not-for-profit organisation, probably not going to have a lot of money to invest, you know. So how is this going to link to the not-for-profit? I was coming to this session thinking differently from
Well, you can't reduce income to zero, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. So, but then with not-for-profit, we get money from the government, So we don't want to risk that money. We want to actually use it for the goals of the organisation.
A lot of not-for-profits that we do before, and I don't know if people in the room is similar, have money.
So cash reserves for non-service leave is something they would have organisations, then you go back and nothing.
I understand that, but
So this is not how you all government grants.
Yeah, I know, but how to actually
Change investment strategy, make
Yeah.
most of the money you've got.
My organisation's got 6 figures in the bank as for many years. The interesting thing we find is that our board members are all financially illiterate, except for the treasurer, me. They're naturally risk averse. There's no way. So the only option that as an NFP we have is with a government guarantee, the money sitting in the bank at 0% or 1% in a term deposit is easily the best investment we can make, because you still get a return, it's not negative, it's not volatile, and our other board members actually understand what that risk profile is. So from us, we don't do
So
anything else other than
is that your mandate, or is that just because?
That's just because that's where they sit. And to be fair, I'm financially literate, but I couldn't persuade them to do anything else at the moment.
And quite often your board is well, lucky laws are all the same risk groups, that we can quite often just have a complete mix of risk takers on the board, and then they can't agree. So we still need to do cash because they can't agree, so we just let it through. And we're finding, what we've had to consider this week with the coronavirus is now we have to shut down, the infrastructure coming, we've got animals to feed. So we still have to bring people on, we've got to keep paying. Regardless, we can't, because we can't put everybody on or unpaid everybody. So that liquidity this week has all of a sudden become really important, and perhaps we're very grateful that that's where our board has said this is where it's going to be.
And it's trying to, it's never a perfect answer. And the point of today is, like what you're saying, is we come across a lot of not-for-profits and individuals as well that actually don't know what their options are. So this is not about saying this is better for you, I recommend something. This is just understanding what your options are out there. And the reality of where you're at now, if liquidity and safety is the main thing to you, obviously a TD or a cash in bank is the safest and most liquid place to have your money. But by the same token, you're getting nothing. Less than you're losing real money by having it in the bank account. Now, if you then decide and say, well, that's okay because of all the advantages that gives me, liquidity and safety, that's a fine answer. It's just knowing what other alternatives that you have. Now, that may then mean you structure things and say, well, we'll have 80% in that, but look, we can put 20% in something else. That's not a recommendation, it's just a consideration of understanding what your options are.
Do you come to board meetings? Is that something to colleagues in the room? That is something to...
Yeah, we can,
to the board
absolutely.
meeting to say
Yep.
these are the options?
We can. So just so you know, I work for a Canberra, which is a partner with Collins & Co.
Yeah.
Luke over here, Broxton here, is the advisor that works with Collins & Co. So we are joint venture partners. So if you have any need like that, we're more than happy to have a chat.
Yeah.
And again, we're not, the thing that I come across a lot, I wouldn't say frustrated by it, is the people don't know. People don't know what their options are, and this is why you would see I emphasise the risk as well, because there's no free lunch in life, right? And there's no free lunch with your investing, absolutely. It's just understanding what your options are. Now, if someone says to me, thank you for explaining that, that's not appropriate for us, fine. That's a fine conversation. What I don't like to see is when somebody says, I actually didn't know that it existed. I didn't know what options they had, and I'm too scared to do it because not understanding something, we're all human. If you don't understand something, you don't do it. You're naturally, you go, least path of resistance, I don't get it, I don't do it. So if we can help, and we're more than happy to help, not-for-profits particularly, if we can help at least in educating your board and saying, well, these are your options, similar to what we're putting here, and also field questions from them, that often at least will get the conversation happening. I think that's really important to have that conversation and understand. It's easy just to leave money in cash. It's easy, but it's not really getting any return. And like you saw, and like you've seen from the markets, and I just showed then, things are going lower, not higher. Things aren't going to get better. So that's just where we are at the moment. So yes, to answer your long way of answering your questions, yes, we're more than happy to help if we can. What's everyone else's thoughts? I know everyone else has different scenarios, but similar to you, I know yours is probably you get money in, goes money out.
Well, I guess from the board point of view, I can understand for them they think about reputation first, because they don't want the public to see that they get the money and invest someplace else risky. You see? So that's to get to what I'm saying. So they go, okay, this is the money you get in, this is where it's supposed to go, not to the investment. And that is sometimes can be difficult for you to tell them actually, you're going to money anyway, if you want to. We don't want to do it like this because if something happens, we are accountable.
Absolutely. And look, what it might even be is you go shift risk a little bit, so you go for that enhanced cash, which is essentially that let's call it 2% at the moment. It's still better than nothing. So that might be where you go, look, we don't want to take the most risk. This is a little bit more risk, but the reality is CBA, NAB, going to pay me, Westpac going to pay me 90 to 180 days. Most likely they will. Like it's extremely likely. There'd have to be some Armageddon situation for big four banks not to pay for that money back. So that might be a consideration. Go look, it's not a phenomenal return, but it beats 0.25.
So what are well cashed out?
It depends. It's hard. They're generally very conservative. It just depends how much money they've got first and what their liability is. I think I find the two most important considerations: what do you have, and what's your liability outlook like? When do you need that money? Because the reality is, if you're a not-for-profit, you need to shell out that money if you need to, right? So they're the two assessments you're led by, and it depends how much they've got. So if they've got a long-term perspective, not many, to be fair, go into that higher end of the risk spectrum, but they do enhance the returns, particularly in that enhanced cash. Some may even have some equities in there as well. So it might be a case of people 80% is something that's really safe, that we consider to be really safe. That will be really liquid cash, some enhanced cash, and we might put a small allocation into what is volatile equities, but we're getting a good rate of return because we most likely won't need that money for 4 or 5 years. So we get some growth in there, we get some good income in there, and that builds up our reserves over time. Because I almost look at the other side when I talk to boards as well, is not only is being conservative part of your mandate, but also you must be fiscally responsible. If you're in the real world losing money by having it in the bank as well, you need to consider that. Because $100 today is not going to be $100 in 5 years' time. So if someone says to you, well, here, give me $100 and I'll pay you no rate of return, let's say it's $101 in 5 years, well, really, you don't have $101. You could call it $94, $95 in 5 years' time. So it's just that way of thinking, I think, is important for people to consider. And believe me, I'm not saying everyone go out and take massive risks. I just really understand what the risks are. And what the risks are doing nothing. There's risks in doing nothing as well. So it's just more understand it. And then at least know your options. I'm happy for people to understand their options and say, no, thank you. At least you consider it and you know it. Instead of not knowing that frustrates me. Any other questions at all? Anyone got anything? All right, well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to us.